When we talk about American politics today, the term evangelical voters comes up constantly.
All the time.
It's usually tied to a specific election or a policy fight, but that phrase, it represents this vast history, centuries of theological shifts and, well, institutional change.
It really does.
So today, we're going deep into that history. We're using Francis FitzGerald's monumental book, The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America.
A truly massive work.
And many of you will know FitzGerald from her Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Vietnam, Fire in the Lake. So when she takes on a topic, she really takes on the whole thing.
She leaves no stone unturned.
Our mission today is, I'll admit, ambitious. We're going to try and trace the trajectory of American evangelical Protestantism.
And focusing, as FitzGerald does, mainly on the white movements.
From its colonial roots through the Great Revivals all the way up to the 2016 election, we really want to give you the historical context you need to understand today's headlines.
And what's so striking about this book, as FitzGerald lays it out, is that the core question isn't just theological. It's profoundly political.
How so?
Well, she asks how this huge religious movement became such a sustained, powerful political force on the right, a force that has fundamentally shaped the U.S. culture wars and public policy.
So we're exploring the evolution of ideas for sure, but also the institutions and the leaders that made that political power possible.
Exactly. Not adjudicating the theology, but understanding the mechanics of its power.
Okay, so let's get into the foundational ideas. The ones she argues have been there for centuries. In the early chapters, she really anchors this history in colonial Calvinism.
And the Great Awakening revivals. The key identity that comes out of figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield was this absolute necessity of a personal conversion.
The born-again experience.
That's it. That is absolutely crucial. But FitzGerald argues the structure that kind of holds the whole system together is what she calls the Jeremiad tradition.
Jeremiad. That's a specific term. What does that actually sound like in practice?
It's a warning. It's named after the prophet Jeremiah. It's this cyclical narrative where a preacher warns the nation that its sin has broken its covenant with God.
So disaster is on the horizon.
Imminent disaster. But, and this is the key part, that warning is always paired with an assurance. The idea that if the nation repents and restores its righteous values, that divine judgment can be avoided.
So it creates this incredible drama. You have this existential risk, but also this real hope of renewal.
And you can see how motivating that would be, not just for your own personal salvation, but for collective national action.
It's a structural tension that just repeats itself over the centuries.
It does. But we do need to pause here and clarify the scope of the book, which FitzGerald is very explicit about. She focuses almost entirely on white evangelical movements.
She frames African-American church history as, I think the quote is, a different story.
She does. And that's a limitation reviewers point to again and again. It really narrows the lens to one specific stream of this history.
Which, as we'll get into, tends to skew the story toward political conservatism.
It does.
So that framework brings us to the big question. How does this very personal, individual experience of conversion and the cyclical Jeremiad shift from being about what happens inside a church to becoming a mandate for party politics?
Well, what FitzGerald observes is a gradual evolution. The tradition moves away from being primarily revivalist, focused on saving souls, and becomes a self-conscious political movement.
The goal changes.
The goal expands. It's not just saving souls anymore. It's about politically restoring what they see as a Christian America. And the main vehicle for that becomes direct engagement with the government, specifically with the Republican Party.
And the book is great at pointing out these key historical moments, these inflection points where that mobilization really happens. We're moving from the revival tent to the courtroom.
That's a great way to put it. A key early battle was the Scopes trial in 1925.
The monkey trial.
Right, pitting fundamentalism against modern science. And while the fundamentalists technically won the case, the public perception was terrible. They were seen as, foolish.
And that pushed them into a period of retreat from public life.
For a time. But it wasn't permanent. Not at all. The mid-century brings us neo-evangelicalism and its icon, Billy Graham,
who absolutely mastered mass media.
He projected a spiritual message onto the national stage. He had ear of presidents. But the real consolidation into a unified political force happens after the 1960s.
The backlash.
The backlash to everything. To feminism, the sexual revolution, challenges to school prayer, all of that created the perfect engine for the Christian right to emerge in the late 20th century.
So the political movement wasn't really born from a positive vision, but more from a reaction, a resistance to what they saw as moral decline.
As FitzGerald's work suggests, that resistance provided the fuel. Issues like the legalization of abortion or the push for the Equal Rights Amendment gave leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson a focal point to build these huge, powerful political networks.
And the book is just praised for weaving all of this together. The denominational history, the biographies, the political strategy. It really shows how these networks influenced everything.
From slavery and abolition to civil rights and gender.
Okay, this brings us to the why, the causal framing. This is where FitzGerald connects their theology, these apocalyptic schemas, to a very stark worldview, a Manichaean reading of social conflict.
That term Manichaean sounds very academic. Let's break that down.
Please, for the listener, what does that mean in practical terms?
It's the ultimate us versus them. FitzGerald uses it to describe a worldview where political conflicts aren't debates between two different, flawed policy ideas.
Yeah.
They're seen as an ultimate battle between cosmic good and absolute evil. There's no middle ground, no gray area.
A good versus evil framing, which would certainly fuel intense activism. I mean, you can't compromise with evil.
Precisely. Retreat isn't an option. The book really draws this through line, showing how anxieties about secular humanism, about feminism, about changing sexual norms created the pressure to form this powerful political coalition.
An alliance with free market and libertarian ideologies.
Right, producing the very distinct shape of the late 20th century Christian right, which prioritized political power.
And we see this reach its peak, or at least its most interesting point, with the alignment with Ronald Reagan and then eventually Donald Trump, which raises a huge question of consistency.
It does.
How does a movement so focused on personal moral character align with a figure like Trump, who seemed to violate so many of those values?
FitzGerald's narrative frames that decision as purely pragmatic. The political movement, having adopted this Manichaean framework, didn't see Trump as a moral guide.
No, they saw him as a tool.
A flawed but very useful instrument. The strong man who could defend them against secular forces, protect their religious liberty, and most importantly, appoint conservative judges.
So the immediate policy victory outweighed any concerns about moral purity.
Well, for the political wing, absolutely.
This historical view really helps connect the dots, doesn't it? It connects these old internal church arguments over science and the Bible to today's really explosive culture wars.
It gives you the historical DNA for modern polarization. FitzGerald really clarifies why battles over things like abortion or school prayer or LGBTQ rights are fought so fiercely. They're seen as existential.
Which is invaluable for any listener trying to make sense of modern politics.
I think so.
But we have to be balanced here and talk about the critiques of the book, as you said earlier, by focusing so heavily on the political leaders of the Christian right.
People like Falwell and Pat Robertson.
The book, as some reviewers argue, risks downplaying the quieter local piety or internal dissent, or even the evangelicals who are focused on social justice.
That's right. If your only measure is the political megaphone, you miss the diversity within the tradition. And that brings us back to the most significant critique.
The omission of African-American evangelicalism.
Yes. Scholars consistently point out that Black churches have been central to a completely alternative Christian politics. Abolitionism, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement.
So why is leaving that out so significant for her overall argument?
Because that decision narrows the story to only being about white evangelicalism's struggle to shape America.
I see.
And if you read the book through a human rights lens, as it invites you to, you see two very different ways religion can be mobilized. A politics of hierarchy and restoration, or a politics of liberation.
That's a powerful contrast. One movement, driven by that Jeremiad, is trying to restore an idealized, often hierarchical past.
Which can be used to justify things like resisting civil rights.
While the other movement, rooted in Black churches, uses its faith to demand radical reform and liberation.
Exactly. So when FitzGerald omits that liberation-focused counter-story, the movement as a whole risks being seen as just one thing. A monolithic conservative voting bloc.
Which flattens its own spiritual complexity.
It absolutely does.
So what does this comprehensive history really mean for you, the learner? FitzGerald's work is this powerful case study. It shows how religious convictions, even within the same broad tradition, can be used to defend power structures or to demand radical change.
And this history invites a constant question for us today. Which strands of this thought promote a more inclusive vision of liberty and neighbor love, one that elevates the marginalized? and which ones, conversely, constrain the ability of all people to flourish equally. It forces you to look at the real-world results of religious politics.
FitzGerald's work gives us such crucial context for our current moment, and it suggests a final thought for you to take away. When any major religious tradition focuses most of its energy on restoring an idealized path through political power, it risks losing its own spiritual depth. So think about what we all lose, both the country and the tradition itself, when we view any major religious movement solely through the actions of its loudest and most political leaders.